The number 7 umbilical had been giving us trouble for 3 days. Microfractures in the outer sheathing. Nothing dangerous yet, but I'd learned a long time ago that nothing stays nothing for long in deep space. You fix small problems or they grow into the kind that kill people. I was running my gloved hand along the junction where the umbilical met the hull mount, feeling for irregularities the diagnostic couldn't catch, when something passed through the ship. A vibration that seemed to originate from everywhere, with nothing to explain it, and it made the tools on my belt shift against my hip as if gravity had briefly forgotten which way was down. I pulled my hand back from the junction and waited. 15 years on research and industrial vessels teaches you to wait. Engines do strange things. Experiments do stranger things. You wait for the all clear, then you go back to work. The all clear never came. Instead, the intercom crackled with fragments, shouting from somewhere below me, words I couldn't pass, then a crash that might have been equipment, or might have been a body, then silence. The intercom stayed open. I could hear breathing, fast and wet, and then that cut out too. I secured my tools, clipped the diagnostic unit to my belt, and started moving toward the central lift. The corridors on Deck 2 were empty. Everyone assigned to this level was either in their bunks or down on the science deck for the observation experiment. I'd heard them talking about it in the mess hall for weeks. Quantum something, observation something, a chance to prove something that would make their careers. I didn't understand it and didn't try to. My job was keeping physical connections intact. Theirs was whatever happened in Lab 7. The lift opened on a woman I recognized. Dr. Vestergaard, lead researcher on the observation team. She walked past me without stopping, without looking at me, her hands held slightly away from her body. There was blood on them, a lot of blood. It had gotten under her nails and into the creases of her palms, and she was holding them like they belonged to someone else. Doctor. She kept walking. Her shoes left faint red prints on the deck plating. Vestergaard always spoke. She was the type who couldn't pass you in a corridor without explaining something, asking something, filling silence with her voice. I'd fixed a cable routing issue for her 3 months ago, and she'd talked at me for 20 minutes about the implications of coherent observation states while I worked. Now she walked past me like I wasn't there. I watched her turn a corner at the end of the corridor, then stepped into the lift and hit the button for Deck 4. The descent took too long. I counted seconds out of habit. The lift was rated for 4 seconds between decks. I counted 11 before the doors opened. Corridor 6 outside Lab 7 was crowded. Engineers, life support techs, 2 of the navigation officers, the ship's cook still wearing his apron. People who normally had no business being here, standing in loose clusters at a distance from the lab's open hatch. Nobody was talking. A few of them were looking at their feet, or at the walls, or at their own hands. None of them were looking at the hatch. I pushed through. Someone grabbed my arm. Mitchell from Environmental Systems, a woman I'd worked with on the ventilation refit last year. Blake, don't! I shook her off and kept moving. The hatch was open. The emergency lights had activated, painting everything in red tones that made it hard to judge distance and depth. Beyond the hatch was the observation chamber, the heart of Lab 7, the space where the science team had spent 8 months installing equipment I didn't understand. The walls were wrong. I stopped in the hatchway and tried to make sense of what I was seeing. The chamber was designed as a perfect cube, 6 meters on each side, lined with sensor arrays and monitoring equipment. I'd helped install the cable routing myself. I knew the geometry of this room the way I knew the geometry of my own hands. Now the metal surfaces bowed inward. The structures remained intact but had softened into curves, as if something outside the room was pressing against them, as if the chamber were a box being slowly crushed by a fist. The curvature was subtle but undeniable. The corner where Wall A met Wall B no longer formed a clean angle. The ceiling dipped toward its center like the surface of a soap bubble. On the floor, 2 bodies. Training took over. You see a body, you check for life signs, you assess injuries, you call for medical. You don't stand in the doorway staring. I crossed the threshold and immediately felt the wrongness intensify. The floor stayed solid under my boots, but the angles of the room kept shifting at the edges of my vision, as if the space couldn't decide what shape it wanted to be. I focused on the bodies. The first was Alden. Senior researcher, Nigerian, mid-40s. We'd played cards in the mess hall twice. He'd beaten me both times and been gracious about it. Now he lay face up with his chest cavity open, ribs spread like the petals of a flower, and inside, every organ and every trace of blood had disappeared, leaving smooth interior walls, slightly curved, the color of pale plastic. He looked like a mannequin someone had cracked open. His eyes were still open, still human, still Alden's eyes, staring at a ceiling that no longer met itself in straight lines. The second was Rice. Junior researcher, German, couldn't have been older than 25. She was breathing. Her chest rose and fell in shallow, irregular hitches. I moved toward her, stepping around Alden's body, and as I got close, I saw that her eyes were open too. They moved independently. The left eye tracked something to my right. The right eye tracked something behind me. Neither focused on me or seemed aware I was there. I knelt beside her and put my hand on her shoulder, firm, the way you stabilize someone before moving them. "Rice, can you hear me? I'm going to—" Her head snapped toward me. Both eyes locked on my face at once, and for a moment she was completely present, completely aware. And what I saw in her expression was terrible because it didn't look like fear. Fear I would have understood. Fear would have been appropriate. What I saw was recognition. Like she knew me. Like she'd been waiting for me specifically to walk through that hatch and kneel beside her. "You're watching." Her voice came out clear, entirely wrong for someone with that kind of injury pattern. "You're making it worse. Every time you look, her body seized, her back arched off the floor, limbs rigid, and a sound tore out of her throat, forced up by contracting muscles, something that pushed past her vocal cords without her consent. I tried to hold her still, to keep her from hurting herself, but the seizure was too violent. Her head cracked against the deck once, twice, and then she went limp. I checked for a pulse. Her skin was already cooling. Her face had settled into that expression of recognition. Mouth slightly open, eyes still fixed on me even in death, and I couldn't shake the feeling that she'd seen this moment before, that she'd known exactly how it would go, that she'd come to this room to tell me one sentence and then to die. Behind me, footsteps. The ship's medic, Yilmaz, pushing through the people in the corridor. "Two down," I said. "Alden is gone. Rice, I couldn't—" Yilmaz knelt beside me, already running his scanner over Rice's body. His face stayed professionally blank, but I saw his eyes move to Alden's open chest and hold there for several seconds. What happened to him? I don't know. He was like that when I got here. That makes no sense. Yilmaz moved to Alden, scanner in hand, and I watched him try to make sense of readings that obviously weren't making sense. His organs can't just— Where did they go? There's no blood. The exterior tissue is intact. It's like he was manufactured this way. I didn't have an answer. I was still kneeling beside Rice's body, looking at her eyes, looking at me, and I was thinking about what she'd said. "You're watching. You're making it worse." I looked up at the walls. The curvature had deepened. I was certain of that. The room had grown smaller, tighter, the angles more acute. The corner nearest me no longer even pretended to be a corner, just a smooth curve, metal flowing into metal like wax that had been heated and allowed to cool mid-drip. I fixed my gaze on that curve, trying to see whether it was still moving. It was. The movement came slow, so slow I almost could have called it a trick of the emergency lighting, but it continued. The wall bowed further as I watched, as I focused on it, as I gave it my attention. I looked away, fast, the way you'd pull your hand back from something hot. Looked at my own boots, at the floor. At Rice's hand, limp and pale against the deck plating. Behind me, more people entered the chamber. Voices layered over each other, someone crying, someone trying to establish order. I heard the captain's voice among them, demanding answers no one had. I kept my eyes down. I got to my feet and moved toward the hatch, pushing past incoming crew, ignoring the questions they threw at me. In the corridor, I found a section of wall that was still flat, still normal, still built of right angles, and I put my back against it and breathed. "You're making it worse. Every time you look." Rice had died before she could finish the sentence. I thought about the walls bowing inward. I thought about how the curve had deepened while I watched. I thought about Alden's empty chest, his organs simply absent, as if reality had forgotten to include them. The captain called for lockdown, for all non-essential personnel to return to quarters, for a full damage assessment team to assemble on Deck 4. I pushed off from the wall and started walking toward the EVA prep bay. I had a job: exterior umbilical inspection. I'd been in the middle of it when the experiment triggered. The number 7 junction still had microfractures. There were things I could fix, problems that made sense, work that would tell me whether the laws of the universe were still functioning the way they were supposed to. The corridor stretched ahead of me. 15 meters to the junction with Corridor 8. I'd walked this path 1,000 times, knew it the way I knew the layout of my own quarters. I walked, and the junction refused to get closer. I stopped and looked behind me. The entrance to Corridor 6 waited 3 meters back. I'd only taken a handful of steps, but I'd been walking for almost a minute. I was certain of that. I'd counted my paces without thinking about it, an old habit from line work where you need to know exactly how far you've gone in case you need to find your way back. 12 paces, at least 20 meters covered, if distance still meant anything. I turned back toward the junction and kept walking. This time I watched my feet, watched the deck plates pass beneath me, and they were passing. I was making progress, but when I looked up, the junction stood at the same distance. Then it didn't. The junction sat right in front of me. I was at the intersection of corridors 7 and 8, exactly where I'd been trying to go, and I couldn't say when I'd arrived there. The transition had happened somewhere between one step and the next, between one breath and another, in a gap I couldn't locate. Down corridor 8, someone stood. A figure in the standard blue jumpsuit of the engineering crew, facing away from me, motionless. "Hey!" My voice came out rough. "You all right?" The figure didn't respond. I started walking toward them. 10 meters, 8, 6. And then I was at the EVA prep bay door, and the corridor behind me was empty. No figure, no one standing there. Just emergency lighting and closed hatches and the low vibration of the ship's systems that suddenly didn't feel as familiar as they should have. I opened the prep bay door. The room was exactly as I'd left it 8 hours ago. My suit in its rack, number 4, the name Blake stenciled on the chest plate, tools organized on the bench, diagnostic equipment powered down but ready. Normal, completely normal. I moved to my suit and started the pre-EVA checklist. Seals intact, pressure systems nominal, life support reservoirs full. My hands knew this work. They'd been doing it for 15 years. Check the gloves, check the boots, check the helmet ring for microdamage, check the emergency beacon. Somewhere on Deck 4, people were dead. Somewhere on Deck 4, walls were bending in ways that metal couldn't bend. Somewhere on Deck 4, a woman had looked at me like she'd known my whole life and told me I was making it worse. My hands kept working. Check the thruster pack, check the tether system, check the magnetic clamps. This was what I knew. This was what I could do. Whatever had happened in Lab 7, whatever the observation team had triggered or unleashed or broken, I couldn't fix it. I didn't understand it. But I could check the umbilical junctions. I could make sure the ship's exterior connections were intact. I could do my job. The prep bay door opened behind me. I turned, hands still on my suit's chest plate. and saw Chief Engineer Anand in the doorway. She looked shaken, which was wrong. Anand had survived a reactor breach on the Kepler 12 years ago, had held the repair team together for 18 hours while the radiation shielding failed around them, and I'd never seen her look anything other than completely in control. Captains postponed external operations. She leaned against the doorframe like she needed the support. No one goes out until we understand what happened. The number 7 junction. I know, I saw your report, it'll wait. She rubbed at her temples with both hands, pressing hard enough to leave white marks on her brown skin. Blake, what did you see in there? I told her. Alden's empty chest, Rice's eyes tracking 2 different things, the walls curving inward, curving more while I watched. Anand listened without interrupting. When I finished, she stayed quiet for a long time. The science team said the experiment was supposed to be observation only. Her hands were still pressed against her temples. No physical interaction with the test subjects. Just quantum-level measurement. Just looking. What were they looking at? I don't know. Something about coherence patterns in vacuum state. Something about the observer effect at macro scale. She dropped her hands and met my eyes. Dr. Vestergaard designed it. She's not talking. She's in medical, sedated. She walked in, saw the bodies and just stopped. Started saying numbers. Random numbers, over and over, for 5 minutes straight. Then she collapsed. I thought about Vestergaard walking past me in the corridor. The blood on her hands. The way she hadn't seen me at all. The walls in that room. I started. Then stopped because I didn't know how to finish the sentence. I know. Anand's voice dropped. I saw them too. And when I looked at the corner nearest the door, I could have sworn. She shook her head. Get some rest, Blake. Captain wants everyone in quarters until further notice. We'll figure out what happened. She left. The door slid closed behind her. I stood in the prep bay with my half-inspected suit and my useless hands, and Rice's last words playing on repeat in my head. You're watching. You're making it worse. Every time you look. The prep bay was quiet. The suit hung in its rack. The tools sat on the bench. Everything was exactly where it should be. I looked at the far wall, at the corner where the bulkhead met the deck. I watched it. The angle held perfect. 90 degrees. Metal meeting metal in a clean, sharp line, exactly as the shipbuilders had intended. I kept watching. For a long time, nothing changed. Then, so slowly I almost convinced myself I was imagining it, the corner began to soften. I looked away from the corner, forced myself to look at my hands instead, at the familiar calluses and the scar across my left palm from a cable snap 6 years ago. Solid things. Things that made sense. When I looked back, the corner was sharp again. 90 degrees. Perfect. Maybe I'd imagined it. Maybe the emergency lighting was playing tricks with shadows and angles. Maybe I was in shock from what I'd seen in Lab 7, and my brain was filling in patterns that weren't there. I didn't believe any of that, but I told myself I did. The captain's order kept us in quarters for 11 hours. I lay on my bunk and stared at the ceiling and didn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Alden's empty chest, Rice's eyes tracking 2 different things, the walls of Lab 7 bowing inward like the room was being swallowed. When the all-clear finally came through the intercom, I was already dressed and moving. The prep bay door opened, and I stopped. Jennings sat on the suit-up bench. Backup pilot, Polish, built like a wrestler. He'd been on the Theorem longer than I had, one of the original crew from the ship's commissioning. We weren't friends, but we'd shared enough watches and enough card games that I knew his habits. Jennings didn't sit still. Jennings paced, fidgeted, drummed his fingers on surfaces, filled silence with motion. Now he sat perfectly still, staring at his own hands. Jennings. He didn't respond. I moved closer, stepping around the suit racks, and as I got near I saw that his face was wet. Clear, slightly viscous fluid seeped from his pores across his forehead and cheeks and jaw, pooling in the hollows of his eyes. "Hey," I put my hand on his shoulder. "You all right?" He looked up. His eyes were the same as always, brown, slightly bloodshot, the eyes of a man who'd spent too many hours staring at navigation displays. But something behind them had fractured. "I keep remembering dying." His voice was of someone reporting routine maintenance data. Different ways. I remember drowning. I remember burning. I remember falling a long fall, watching stars get smaller. I remember being opened up while I was still talking, feeling hands inside my chest, and I couldn't stop talking, because the hands wouldn't let me stop. He looked back down at his own hands, turning them over, studying the palms. "I don't know which one is real. I don't know if any of them haven't happened yet." I didn't know what to say. I didn't know what to do. So I did what I knew. "Come on." I gripped his arm and pulled him to his feet. "Medical. Let's get you checked out." He came with me without resistance, walking beside me through corridors that still looked mostly normal, his face still leaking that clear fluid, his eyes still fixed on nothing I could see. We passed 2 other crew members on the way. Navigation techs, I thought, though I didn't look at them closely, and they pressed themselves against the walls as we went by, staring at Jennings, staring at the wetness on his skin. Medical was crowded. 4 beds occupied, curtains pulled around each one. Yilmaz looked up as we entered, and his face did something complicated, cycling through recognition and exhaustion, and something that might have been despair before settling into professional blankness. Another one. "He's remembering things." I guided Jennings toward an empty bed. "Dying. Different ways." Yilmaz nodded like this made perfect sense, like it was the 4th time today he'd heard exactly this. "I'll take it from here." He already had his scanner out, already moving toward Jennings. "Blake. The captain cleared external operations. Number 7 umbilical is still on the priority list." I glanced at Jennings sitting on the bed, fluid still leaking down his face, hands still turning over and over in his lap. Then I looked at the closed curtains around the other 4 beds and thought about what might be behind them. "Yeah." I backed toward the door. "I'll get to it." The prep bay was empty when I returned. I suited up fast, running through the checklist on autopilot, not letting myself think about corners that softened, or pilots who remembered dying in ways that hadn't happened yet. Seals, pressure, life support, tether system, magnetic clamps. Everything checked green. The airlock cycled and I stepped out onto the hull. The Theorem was a research vessel, 200 meters long, built for extended deep space missions. I'd walked her exterior 100 times. I knew every panel, every junction, every cable routing channel. I knew where the micrometeorite damage was worst, and where the thermal expansion joints needed watching, and where the original construction crew had cut corners that we'd spent years compensating for. The ship beneath me didn't match that knowledge. The panel configuration had shifted. Some sections of hull plating sat meters from where they belonged. Other panels appeared twice. Identical sections occupying spaces that should have held sensor arrays or thruster housings. The portside observation deck's windows existed, and then failed to exist and then reappeared further aft, each version snapping into place for a few seconds before another took its turn. I blinked and forced myself to keep moving. The ship's geometry kept sliding, never quite settling, as if multiple versions of the Theorem were occupying the same space and my eyes couldn't decide which one to show me. I worked anyway. That was what I did. That was who I was. The world could stop making sense and I would still check the cable junctions, still run my hands along the umbilical sheathing, still feel for the microfractures that the diagnostics might miss. My boots clamped to the hull, my tether played out behind me, and my hands did their job while my brain tried not to think about what it was seeing. The number 7 junction sat where it should. The microfractures were where I'd found them yesterday, no worse, no better. I applied sealant, ran the pressure test, marked the repair complete. Normal work, meaningful work, work that would matter if the laws of physics decided to start functioning again. I moved along the hull toward the primary umbilical array, the main junction point where 16 separate data and power lines converged before entering the ship. It was near the stern, a 10-minute traverse in normal conditions. I'd done it so many times I could have made the trip blind. I found the body tangled in the lines. My first thought was that someone had gone EVA without authorization. My second thought was that the suit looked old, really old, the kind of weathering you only see after years of exposure. My third thought was that I recognized the suit's markings. It was Alden. The same name stenciled on the chest plate. The same suit number, 14, that I'd seen hanging in the rack next to mine for the past 8 months. But this suit was degraded, the outer layer pitted and scarred, the seals cracked and leaking frozen residue into the vacuum. I pulled myself closer, one hand on the umbilical lines, and looked at the helmet. The faceplate was intact, but I couldn't see through it. A film of something organic coated the interior surface, frozen and sublimated and frozen again over what must have been years of exposure. I angled my helmet light to cut through the film and saw what was left of the face inside. Smooth, featureless. The skin had survived, still recognizably human skin, but everything else had been erased. Eyes, nose, mouth, the architecture of expression that makes a face. Micrometeorite abrasion over years, decades, had worn them away. But the suit said, Alden. The body dimensions matched Alden. And Alden lay dead on the floor of Lab 7 with an empty chest cavity, had been dead for less than 12 hours, could not possibly have been out here long enough for this to happen. I cut the body free from the umbilical lines. The tether system could handle the extra mass. I started the slow traverse back toward the airlock, towing what was left of someone who had already died once today in a completely different way. The captain met me in the airlock antechamber. Rennick, former military, 15 years commanding research vessels, the kind of man who made decisions quickly and stood by them. He looked at the body on the deck, at the name on the chest plate, at the featureless oval where a face should have been. That's not possible. No. Alden is in the morgue. I saw him myself. He stopped, started again. How long would someone have to be exposed for that kind of degradation? Years, maybe longer. He's been on this ship for 8 months. He's never done EVA without logging it. He's never been outside the ship for more than 4 hours at a stretch. I didn't have an answer. I stood there in my suit, helmet under my arm, looking at the body of a man who had died twice in ways that couldn't both be true. Yilmaz arrived with a stretcher team. They took the body. Rennick followed, his face set in an expression I'd seen before on men trying to make sense of things that didn't make sense, trying to force the universe back into categories it no longer fit. I went back to the prep bay, stripped off my suit, sat on the bench where Jennings had been sitting, and thought about Rice's last words. You're watching. You're making it worse. What did it mean to make it worse? I thought about the walls of Lab 7, bowing inward while I watched. I thought about the corner in the prep bay, softening under my attention. I thought about Alden on the lab floor and Alden tangled in the umbilical lines and how there were now 2 bodies that couldn't both belong to the same timeline. I was too tired to understand any of it, but I was also too wired to sleep, my nerves buzzing with a low-grade current that wouldn't let me rest. I started walking. The ship felt different. Corridors that used to take 30 seconds now stretched longer or collapsed shorter in ways I couldn't predict. Lights flickered at the edges of my vision but held steady when I looked directly at them. Hatches that should have led to familiar spaces opened onto rooms I'd never seen before. Storage bays that weren't on any deck plan. Empty chambers with walls that curved in ways no ship's hull should curve. I closed those hatches quickly and kept moving. Corridor 6, the route between the crew quarters and the engineering section. I'd walked it thousands of times over the past year. I walked it now without thinking about where I was going, just moving, just keeping my body in motion because stopping felt like something I couldn't afford. Anand came the other way. She looked tired, dark circles under her eyes, her usually immaculate uniform wrinkled, her hair escaping from the regulation bun. But she stayed Anand, still solid, still the most competent person on the ship. Blake. She slowed as we approached each other. You brought in the second body? Yeah. The captain's trying to reach mission control. No response. We're getting nothing at all. Even the relay network's carrier waves are absent. She rubbed at her eyes with the heel of her hand. Navigation says our position is undefined. The star charts don't match anything in the database. It's like we're not in mapped space anymore. What does that mean? I don't know. Nobody knows. The science team... She stopped, shook her head. What's left of the science team is locked in their quarters. Dr. Vestergaard is still sedated. The two junior researchers who weren't in the chamber are refusing to discuss the experiment. They keep saying it's impossible, that observation doesn't work that way. I thought about asking what the experiment was designed to do. Decided I didn't want to know. Get some rest if you can. Anand started walking again, moving past me. I need to check the power distribution in Section 3. The readings are showing fluctuations that shouldn't be possible. I nodded and kept walking. Turned the corner into Corridor 7. Anand stood in the middle of the corridor again. She faced me. Burn scars covered her. Old burns, healed over years, the skin thick and ropey and discolored. They ran across the left side of her face, down her neck, over her left arm where the sleeve of her uniform was rolled up. Plasma exposure, reactor burns, the kind of accident that kills most people and leaves the survivors wishing it had. Oh no. Her voice matched the Anand I'd just left, but her eyes were different, wider, afraid in a way I had never seen. You're watching me. I tried to look away. My eyes refused to obey. Please, stop watching me. The burned Anand stepped backward, her hands coming up in front of her chest like a shield. Every time someone watches, there's more of us. There are more versions. Please stop. A hatch opened behind her. A third Anand stepped out. This one was younger, mid-20s at most, the age Anand would have been when she first joined the service, before the Kepler incident, before 15 years of command experience had settled into her face. She wore a cadet's uniform and looked around the corridor with open confusion. Where am I? The young Anand turned in a slow circle, taking in her surroundings. This isn't... I was just in the Academy Commons. How did I... I still watched. I couldn't stop. My gaze moved between the three of them. The burned Anand, the young Anand, the Anand who had just passed me in the previous corridor. And I felt something happening. Something I was doing just by looking, just by paying attention, just by caring about what stood in front of me. A fourth Anand flickered at the edge of my vision. Just for a second. Just long enough for me to see that this version was dead, had been dead for a long time. Her eyes sunken and her skin grey and her mouth open in a scream that carried no sound. The burned Anand started to cry. The young Anand started to scream. The flickering dead Anand vanished and reappeared and vanished again. I closed my eyes. It took everything I had, every ounce of will I'd built up over 15 years of working in environments where panic meant death. I shut my eyes, turned, and ran. Behind me, 3 voices screamed in 3 different pitches. 3 versions of the same woman experiencing 3 different kinds of pain. I ran until I hit a wall, literally hit it, my shoulder slamming into metal. I slid down to the deck, pressed my back against the bulkhead and kept my eyes closed. Somewhere in the ship, 3 versions of Anand suffered because I had looked at them. You're watching. You're making it worse. I understood now. I understood what Rice had been trying to tell me. The experiment had opened something, a wound, and the wound was bleeding. and what it bled was people, versions of people. Every time someone looked, really looked, with attention, with focus, with the intensity of caring about what they saw, the wound produced more. More versions, more variations, more suffering. Existing on this ship had become a form of violence. Every time I noticed someone, I ran the risk of splitting them, multiplying them, creating new versions that shouldn't exist, versions that remembered different pasts, versions that had suffered different fates, versions that were aware of their own impossibility and screaming with the horror of it. I sat there with my eyes closed for a long time. I don't know how long. Time had stopped meaning much. The intercom crackled. "All hands." Captain Rennick's voice. Steady, controlled, the sound of a man holding his command together through sheer force of will. "Report to the mess hall for personnel count and briefing. All hands, this is mandatory." I opened my eyes and looked at the floor. Just the floor. The deck plating with its standard texture, its standard color, its standard arrangement of anti-slip grooves. I got to my feet and started walking toward the mess hall, and I kept my gaze down the entire way. I watched my boots move, watched the deck plates pass beneath me. I avoided the walls, avoided the hatches, avoided the other crew members I passed, even when they spoke to me, even when they asked if I was all right, even when someone grabbed my arm and I shook them off without seeing who it was. The mess hall was full. I could hear the rustle of bodies, the murmur of voices, the particular acoustic signature of a room packed with anxious people. I found a spot near the back wall and leaned against it and kept looking at the floor. "Thank you all for coming." The captain's voice, from somewhere near the front of the room. "I know you have questions. I'm going to tell you what we know." I listened. I didn't look up. At 1400 hours yesterday, the observation team in Lab 7 initiated their primary experiment. Something went wrong. Dr. Alden and Dr. Rice are dead. Dr. Vestergaard is incapacitated. The remaining science team is unable to explain what happened. Murmurs from the crowd, someone crying quietly. Since the experiment, we have experienced anomalies throughout the ship, spatial inconsistencies, temporal discontinuities, and a pause. Duplications. Some of you may have encountered crew members who appear to be variants, alternate versions. We don't understand the mechanism yet. I thought about the 3 Anans screaming in Corridor 7. I wondered if any of them were here, in this room, standing in this crowd. Our communications are down. Navigation is unable to determine our position. We are, effectively, alone. The captain's voice stayed calm. The sound of a man doing his job, holding his people together, refusing to let the situation break him. We are not giving up. A different quality now, steel beneath the calm. We are going to figure out what happened. We are going to find a way to reverse it, or contain it, or survive it. That's what we do. That's who we are. I kept looking at the floor. The deck plating was reassuringly solid, reassuringly normal. It didn't shift or bend or multiply under my gaze. For now, I want everyone to travel in pairs. Don't isolate yourself. If you see someone who appears to be a variant, do not engage. Report to medical immediately. The captain stopped talking. The room went quiet. The kind of silence that comes when people hold their breath, waiting for something terrible to happen. A second voice started speaking. It was the captain's voice, the same words, the same cadence, but slightly out of sync, like an echo, except this echo ran half a second behind and emphasized different syllables. "Travel in pairs," the first voice was saying. "Travel in pairs," the second voice said. The emphasis shifted, the tone just different enough to be wrong. A third voice joined. Then a fourth, all of them Captain Rennick, all of them speaking the same lines with small variations, overlapping, building into a chorus that hovered between harmony and noise without becoming either. Someone in the crowd screamed. I didn't look up. I kept my eyes on the floor, on my boots, on the solid deck plating, and I listened to the sound of multiple captains speaking over each other while the crew of the Theorem fell apart around me. I left the mess hall while the screaming was still building. I kept my eyes down, watched my boots on the deck plating, moved through the crowd by feel, by the pressure of bodies against my shoulders, by the sound of people panicking in a space that had become too small for their fear. Someone grabbed at me, fingers on my arm, my sleeve, my back, and I shook them off without looking, without seeing who they were, without letting my attention land on anyone long enough to do damage. The corridor outside was empty. I walked until I found a small maintenance alcove, a space barely large enough for one person, and I pressed myself into it and closed my eyes and tried to stop thinking. I couldn't stop thinking. That was the problem. That had always been the problem. My mind kept working, kept spinning, kept reaching out toward the people I'd served with for the past year. Jennings remembering deaths that hadn't happened. Anand splitting into versions of herself, burning and young and dead. The captain becoming a chorus. Alden with his empty chest. Alden with his erased face. Alden existing twice in ways that contradicted each other. I thought about Jennings, just a flash. His face, the fluid leaking from his skin. His voice saying, "I keep remembering dying." A moment of concern, of wondering how he was, of caring about someone I'd shared a ship with for 8 months. I opened my eyes. The alcove still looked the same. The corridor still looked the same. Nothing in my immediate surroundings had changed. But I knew. Somewhere on this ship, in medical or somewhere else, another version of Jennings had just flickered into existence. Because I'd thought about him. Because I'd wondered. Because I'd cared. I tested it. I left the alcove and walked toward medical, kept my eyes down, watching only the floor, navigating by memory and by the feel of the ship around me. The corridors ran longer than they should have, or collapsed shorter, but I refused to focus on that. I just walked. Medical's door stood open. I stopped at the threshold and looked at the floor inside. Standard deck plating, a few spots of something dark that might have been blood. And I listened. Yilmaz was talking to someone. His voice sounded strained, exhausted. The voice of a man who had been awake too long dealing with things medical school had never prepared him for. 4 of them now. 4. They appeared within the last 15 minutes. I don't have beds for this. I don't have... Which ones are new? A woman's voice. I didn't recognize it. The 2 on the left. And those 2. A pause. They're all unconscious. Different injuries. One has what looks like decompression trauma. One has burns. The other 2 I can't even... I don't know what happened to them. I don't know what could happen to someone to make them look like that. I'd thought about Jennings 15 minutes ago. I'd wondered how he was. I'd let my mind reach toward him with concern, with care. And now there were 4 of him. I backed away from the door. I stayed in the corridor where they couldn't see me, because seeing me meant thinking about me, and thinking about me might mean... I cut that line of thought short. The ship groaned around me. A deep sound, structural, the kind of noise that usually meant something was wrong with the hull, or the frame, or the fundamental integrity of the vessel. I'd heard that kind of groan before on other ships, and this didn't match it. This sounded almost organic, almost alive. I started walking again. No destination, just movement, just keeping my body in motion while my mind tried to figure out what to do with itself. The problem was attention. The problem was observation. The problem was that human consciousness couldn't help but reach out toward other human consciousness, couldn't help but notice and wonder and care. We were built for it. Millions of years of evolution had shaped us into creatures that tracked faces and voices and the subtle signs of emotion, that paid close attention to the people around us. Now that attention had turned into a weapon. I thought about blinding myself, finding something sharp, putting out my eyes, removing the ability to look. But that wouldn't solve anything. Jennings had multiplied because I'd thought about him, not because I'd seen him. The wound didn't need my eyes. It needed my mind. I thought about killing myself, finding an airlock, cycling through, letting the vacuum take me before I could do any more damage. But I remembered the second Alden, the one tangled in the umbilical lines, the one who had been dead for years in a suit that matched the living Aldens exactly. Death didn't look like an escape. Death just opened another branch, another variation the wound could bleed into existence. I walked. Hatches opened onto spaces that shouldn't exist, corridors that curved back on themselves, rooms that were too large for the hull that contained them, chambers that were dark in ways my headlamp couldn't penetrate. I closed those hatches and kept moving. I lost track of time. Hours maybe longer. The ship's chronometers had stopped making sense, displaying numbers that jumped forward and backward without pattern. My body told me I was tired, hungry, thirsty, but those needs felt distant, muffled, like signals from a radio station I was slowly moving out of range of. I found myself in Corridor 6, the same corridor where I'd seen the three Anans, where I'd watched them multiply under my attention, where I'd finally closed my eyes and run. The corridor lay empty now. I walked its length, watching the floor, and at the end I found a hatch that shouldn't have been there. It sat where the entrance to Lab 7 should have been, but it was larger, twice as tall, twice as wide, the edges of the frame slightly warped as if something had pushed through from the other side. I opened it. The observation chamber had changed. The 6-meter cube had become something else. A space that stretched away from me into darkness my headlamp couldn't measure. The walls curved away at angles that made my eyes water when I tried to follow them. The ceiling rose far above or simply failed to exist, replaced by a blackness that had depth and weight and presence. I stepped through the hatch. The floor stayed solid under my boots. That was something. The deck plating continued for several meters before it stopped, replaced by a surface that looked like metal but felt, when I stepped on it, like something else entirely. It gave slightly under my weight. It felt warm. I walked into the darkness. My headlamp carved a cone of light through the space ahead of me, revealing nothing but more floor, more darkness, more distance. The ship's familiar sounds, the hum of life support, the pulse of the engines, the small creaks and groans of a vessel in space, had faded, replaced by something else. A rhythm, slow and deep, like breathing, like a heartbeat, like the tide of something vast moving in and out. I walked for a long time, longer than the theorem's hull could have contained, longer than any space inside any ship I'd ever worked on. I found them at the center. At first I took it for a structure, some kind of installation, something the science team had built or something that had grown in the chamber after the experiment. It rose from the floor in a rough column, 3 or 4 meters across, stretching up into the darkness overhead. Then I got closer, and my headlamp showed me what it was made of. Bodies, dozens of them, fused together, merged at the boundaries, skin flowing into skin, limbs tangled with limbs, faces pressed against backs, against chests, against faces. I recognized them. Alden, the empty-chested one, and the faceless one, and others I hadn't seen, variations I hadn't created. Anand, the burned one, and the young one, and the dead one, and more, so many more, all of them joined into the structure like components of a single organism. Jennings, Vestergaard, Yilmaz, Rennick, crew members I'd barely known, faces I'd passed in corridors without learning names, all of them here, all of them merged, all of them part of this thing that breathed and pulsed and watched. Because it was watching. I felt that. The structure had no single face turned toward me, but its attention pressed against my skin like heat, like the weight of a stare multiplied 100 times over. I should have run. I should have closed my eyes and turned and fled the way I'd fled from the Anans in the corridor. I didn't. I stood there, headlamp illuminating the thing my attention had helped build, and I looked at it. Really looked. Let myself see the faces I recognized, the bodies I'd served with, the people who had become this because of what the experiment had opened and what human observation had fed. The structure communicated. Meaning arrived pressed directly into my mind, without words or sounds, bypassing language. I felt it the way I might feel heat or cold or the vibration of engines through a hull. Thank you for looking. I took a step backward. Reflex. Fear. Thank you for caring. Every time you think of us, we become more. We are in pain. We are grateful. We cannot stop watching you watch us watching you. I understood. This was the wound. A feedback loop. Consciousness observing created new branches, and those branches observed back, and their observation created more observers, and on, in a chain where suffering multiplied suffering without end. It had taken the place of any simple tear in the hull or rupture in space-time or doorway to somewhere else. The ship is inside us now. Or we are inside the ship. The boundary does not exist anymore. We are what observation makes when it cannot stop. We are what caring creates when it has nowhere else to go. The faces in the structure shifted. Mouths opened and closed, eyes tracked. Expressions slid between pain and something else, something that might have been gratitude, or might have been hunger, or might have been love. They were aware. All of them. Every version, every variation, every branch that human attention had made real. They were aware of themselves, of each other, of me standing in front of them with my headlamp and my horror and my inability to look away. You could join us. It would not hurt, or it would hurt, but the hurting would be shared. You would never be alone. You would never be unobserved. You would always matter to someone. I thought about it. I'm not proud of that, but I thought about it. 15 years of working alone in the spaces between ships and stars. 15 years of being the person who fixed things and then went back to his bunk, who played cards with crew members but never let himself get too close, who kept his relationships professional and his feelings tamped down and his attention focused on cables and seals and junctions instead of people. The structure offered something I'd never had. Connection. Permanence. The certainty that someone would always be watching, always be aware, always be caring about whether I existed. But I looked at the faces in the structure. I looked at the pain there, the genuine suffering, the awareness of their own impossibility. I looked at the way they were fused together, boundaries dissolved, individuality consumed. And I thought about what it would mean to add myself to that, to become another face in the mass, another observer feeding the loop, another source of attention creating more versions, creating more attention, creating more pain. We will not force you. We cannot force anyone. The wound only takes what is offered. The wound only grows from what is given freely. I sat down. The floor was warm under me, that same not quite metal surface that gave slightly under pressure. I crossed my legs and rested my hands on my knees and looked at the structure, at the composite of everyone I had served with and everyone I had failed, and everyone I had multiplied through the simple act of caring about them. I'm sorry. My voice sounded small in the vast space, human, completely inadequate for what I was apologizing for. The structure shifted. The faces moved, rearranging themselves, and for a moment I could see them more clearly, each individual, each variation, each version of the people I'd known. They watched me, all of them. Hundreds of eyes, hundreds of expressions, hundreds of variations on grief and pain, and something that might have been forgiveness. You did not know. The experiment was supposed to observe, but none of you understood that observation goes both ways, that looking is a kind of touching, that caring acts as creation. I can't fix it. No, nothing here can be fixed. The wound is permanent. The loop cannot be closed. As long as consciousness observes, more branches will form, more versions will emerge, more suffering will accumulate. This is what we are now. This is what the universe becomes when it learns to watch itself. I thought about getting up, walking away, finding some corner of the ship, if there was still a ship, where I could hide, where I could try not to think about anyone, where I could let myself dissolve into numbness and hope that my lack of attention would somehow slow the bleeding. But that wasn't who I was. 15 years of line work had taught me one thing above all others. When something goes wrong, you stay. You don't run. You don't look away. You plant your boots and you face the problem and you do whatever you can, even if what you can do is almost nothing, even if the best you can manage is to bear witness while everything falls apart. The structure understood. I felt it understand. You are staying. Yeah. You are watching. Someone should. It will hurt. Watching us hurts us. Our pain increases when observed, but our pain is also witnessed. It becomes real because someone knows. It matters because someone cares. I looked at the faces of my crewmates, frozen in their variations of suffering. I looked at Alden's open chest beside Alden's erased face beside Alden's intact body that had somehow burned to death. I looked at Jennings remembering deaths that had all happened and none happened, and were still happening somewhere in the infinite branches of the wound. They were in pain. My watching deepened that pain. They were also seen. They were also known. Their suffering stayed visible instead of vanishing into darkness or disappearing into the void. It carried weight because someone stood there to witness it. I didn't know if that mattered. I didn't know if being witnessed was worth the cost of being seen. I didn't know if my presence here was mercy or cruelty, or some combination that human ethics had never developed words for. But I knew I couldn't leave. There are other versions of you, in other parts of the wound. They are making different choices. One is running, one is screaming, one has torn out his own eyes, one is laughing in a way that will not stop, one is praying to gods he never believed in. This version sits, this version watches, this version stays. The structure settled, the faces stopped changing. The breathing rhythm continued, slow and deep, but the pressure of attention changed, became something almost like acceptance. I sat on the warm floor in the darkness beyond Lab 7, in the space where the theorem had been consumed by the wound it had opened, and I watched the thing my observation had helped create. I watched my crewmates suffering. I watched them aware of their suffering. I watched them watching me watch them. The loop continued, would always continue. Somewhere, in the vast expanding architecture of the wound, new branches formed. New versions of people who had existed, or might have existed, or would exist if someone thought about them hard enough. The universe had learned to watch itself, and now it couldn't stop. All I could do was be here for it. I thought about the umbilical systems I'd maintained for 15 years. The cables and tethers and emergency retrieval lines that connected things that would otherwise drift apart. I thought about how my whole career had been about maintaining connection, about keeping the lines intact, about making sure that when something went wrong there was always a way to bring people back. I couldn't bring anyone back from this. The wound was permanent. The damage was done. But I could stay connected. I could keep the line taut. I could remain here, watching, witnessing, making sure that all this suffering was at least observed by someone who understood what it meant. The structure breathed. The faces watched. The darkness stretched away in all directions, deeper than any space should be, containing more versions of reality than any universe should hold. I sat with my hands on my knees and looked at the thing my attention had fed, and kept my eyes open. Somewhere in the wound, other Blakes made different choices. One version ran until he found a wall that wasn't there, and fell into darkness. One version gouged his eyes with his own fingers and discovered that blindness didn't stop the bleeding. One version tried to kill himself and became 2 versions, then 4, each dying in different ways, each aware of all the others, each screaming in a harmony that would never resolve. This version sat. This version watched. This version said, "I'm sorry" again, quietly, to faces that couldn't forgive him, and couldn't blame him, and couldn't stop seeing him see them. The wound continued to bleed. The loop continued to turn. The universe continued to observe itself in pain. And in the darkness where a ship used to be, one version of a man who used to fix things stayed with what he couldn't fix, bearing witness to the birth of something that should never have been born, keeping his eyes open because closing them would have felt like abandonment he couldn't perform.